Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Really happy to see our audience here at the New School and also online. My name is Kristen Morse, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for New York City Affairs. We are a 60-year-old policy research organization here at the New School, and so excited to be collaborating today with the Zollberg Institute and Equity for Children. You'll hear today from my colleague, Natasha Quiroga, who's going to talk about the work that we've been doing with Inside Schools. Inside Schools has been helping public school families access quality education for going on 20 years. We have always prided ourselves in helping the most vulnerable families, and I think the work that you'll hear about today is a great example of that work. I want to thank a couple of our supporters. We are funded by the Carnegie Foundation, the New York Community Trust, the Altman Foundation, and the Mailman Foundation, again, in addition to Zollberg that funded the research that we'll be discussing today. So thank you again to our co-hosts, Equity for Children. I'm really excited to hand it off to board member Tom from Equity for Children. So let me pass our camera on there.
Camera, thank you, Kristen. Many thanks to the Zollberg Institute for their generosity, and we're particularly proud to co-present with the Center for New York, the truly wonderful Center for New York City Affairs. Yeah. Medical procedure prevented Alberto Minuhin, the founder and director, from joining us today. So he asked me to say a few words about Equity for Children as a board member. I've been lucky to work in higher education, on Wall Street, in biotechnology, and I helped found a London-based conservation nonprofit focused on protecting endangered species. But I've always prioritized Equity for Children. It's the most meaningful work I have ever done. It's unbelievable, but we're celebrating our 20th year this year. And for those of you who don't know our work, we're a global organization focused on research and publications, of course, but also importantly, advocacy and a strong belief in defending the rights of the most vulnerable. Interestingly, Professor Minuhin's education and research is in statistics. We're known for our quantitative work. For example, our analysis of multidimensional child poverty. Poverty, of course, cannot be measured in income. Some of the neediest children in the world are in the highest income countries. Our analytics in this area have attracted global attention. I would encourage you to look at the new book, Urban Inequalities, a multidimensional and international perspective. Professors Minuhin and Della Monica contributed a chapter on children and adolescents in urban settings. Their research shed light on the complicated issues facing the poorest young people in large cities. Less quantitative is our work in voice and participation, where we've raised the radical idea that if you want to help children, you have to listen to them. The role of schools in inclusion is a focus. Gabrielle Crespo, our associate director, is here today if you want to learn more about Equity for Children. I strongly encourage you also to visit our website. Gabrielle and I put a lot of time into it. It's a rich resource for those studying and working in the field, as well as anyone interested in protecting the rights of vulnerable children. So many thanks to everyone here and online. And with that, I will turn the podium over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Tom. My name is Stephanie Rodriguez. I am Peruvian human rights lawyer, but I'm also a grad student at the anthropology program here at the New School. And I'm very happy to be part of the research, especially me being a migrant myself. Can we start with the first PPT? Thank you. The city of New York has been historically a space for migrants, particularly for Latin American migrants. And one of the recent waves of Latin American migrants particularly started in 2022 because of Joe Biden presidency's policies in the borders, and especially because of the state of Texas transporting migrants to New York as to solve the problem of migrants in the city. And this, of course, implicates different multidimensional problems for the city, for the migrants, and also to highlight that Latin American migrants are not the only ones that face these difficulties and challenges in the New York City, but because of the closeness that we have due to our language, because I speak Spanish, I was able to make the interview in Spanish, and also the approach the inside schools does, and given that most of the families that receive this service are Latin American families, it's focused on that demographic. Yes. I can go ahead. The next, please. I'm just going to highlight very briefly in the 15 minutes that I'm giving a lot of the topics that have been raised up in the interviews and the research that we've been doing, not only with people, but also reviewing literature and news and documentation that is available, public information. And first, with the methodology, I would like to focus that this research is mostly qualitative, even though I'm going to show a lot of statistics. I'm basing of 6 interviews that I've conducted with mothers and parents, caregivers in the New York City that have faced housing issues and have been housing in the shelters that the New York City has to offer. And our research question is how do newly arrived Latin American migrant families living in family shelters experience and navigate their children's integration into the New York City public school system? As I said, I not only conducted interviews with caregivers, mostly mothers, but also with your members of the Inside Schools team, and I appreciate the time that you give me to do the research. Also, participant observation in 2 of the workshops. Natasha is going to explain more about Inside School work. And 2 of these workshops were in the city, one here in the new school, and the other one in the historical study in New York, and also on-site visits to the shelter that Natasha also is going to explain further. First, facing the journey to migrate to New York City. The most things that in all of the interviews is raised up the violence on our own countries. I'm saying our own because most of the people that migrate to New York, to the US are Venezuelan, Colombian, Mexican, Ecuadorian, also Haitian and from Honduras, from the Latin American map, but also from Senegal, Guinea, Russia, in the top of the statistics. Flood violence and also facing multiple violence through the journey. Half of the people that I interview have walked through the Darien Gap and have walked through the Mexican border. And that also, it has been mentioned several times, not only sexual violence, but also the being afraid of sexual violence. And even though this is not the scope of the research, I think it's worth to mention it. And as after crossing the borders, I tried to draft a little bit the map there. Arriving to New York, 4 of 6 they were in Texas and they were transported to New York. And 4 of them have the asylum status, and 2 of them are planning to respond. And this is connected to the school, to the school dynamics later. Within the shelters, one of the most common challenges not only are the 60-day relocations. In the past year, it was extended for families that had children between 1 to 7, if I'm correct. And also, it was repeated that they appreciate the help and the support that the shelters give in New York City, and it's how the interview usually starts. But in the middle and the end, they would mention the challenges of not being able to, for example, cook in the shelters. And even they felt that sometimes they were lack of privacy because they would search that they actually don't have food in their rooms, and there is the attachment for the food, especially for Latin Americans. I think it's hard on the food here in New York City, and sometimes facing safety situations. Some of them would mention, I would not like to continue or go back to shelter because I don't know if it's safe, or I have heard cases of violence and sexual violence within the shelters. And I already mentioned the privacy, but connecting to the school dynamics is the limited spaces the children have to study, and also to fulfill other kind of rights as just resting or playing games. I wanted to put a map with the distribution of the shelters along the city of New York, and also wanted to mention that even though the shelters do not respond to the necessity of migrants in the city, the new administrations and the city are announcing that they're closing them down, and this is increasing the uncertainty that is already here in the city, and they're already facing as migrants, with most of them not documented, not regular migrants. And I wanted to notice that in the interviews conducted, we have anonymized all the information because a lot of information shared was pretty sensitive. Even it was one of the limitations that I think we've been facing us doing research, how to continue and do it safely in this context. Going to the language barriers, because as I mentioned at the beginning, I speak Spanish too. All the interviews with the caregivers were in Spanish, and this is also reflected in how the school system is designed. In most of the statistics that you can see in this chart, that is public information, most of the students are Hispanic, and this is, I want to highlight that this is an ethnicity table, but you can infer that it's related to Spanish. And even though a lot of the schools do have bilingual programs, they are not enough, or the claims are that the professors are not either trained or prepared enough to navigate multilingual classrooms. This is not only about education, but also to respond to bullying or violence within schools. In two of the interviews, the moms shared that their children have been facing violence within their classrooms, and they did not have the response that the school, like they would expect from the school, not even when their children were physically with bruises. And it's not, and they mentioned it's not the same with children from other ethnicities. Also with the language barriers, there are different programs that we can to make an abstract is to share the contents in both Spanish and English at the same time. Some of the students, they don't have the proficiency in the language, which is most of the cases, so they have to learn the language first. What's the problem here is that then the contests get delayed, and this is something that would continue in the next years, and then there are other difficulties that can be faced in the school system. But the other outcome of the question about the language barriers is that a lot of the children, because of their personalities and because of the autonomy that they have developed, they have been learning very fast the language, which is a good outcome. And they would speak both language, English and Spanish, but their parents would not. So they help navigate the city to their parents, translating, helping them to not only in communication with other people, but also with the different signs that are around the city. Not only helping the parents, but in the cases of families, there was one family that had 3 children, the middle children that learned the language faster, they would also help the other 2, brother and sister. And this, I think this thing also is related to the autonomy and thinking of children and not as passive actors in the society, but rather active. And how the mothers, the caregivers feel about that. One quote is like, my son adapted quickly to English, but hasn't forgotten Spanish. So it's not only about learning the language, but also to maintaining the native language, in this case, Spanish, and how this makes, I did a chart about bilingual programs around the city. Also, a challenge that they face is transportation. And it's something that we also talked with Natasha in some of the meetings. If the families in the shelters and in the school system, they're giving this card for their children through transport. Sometimes they don't know that they, as a family, have the right to have this free metro card. And I think maybe Natasha, you can explain this better. And what it happens is that most of the families use the children metro card to go to work or to navigate the city, and they ask the children to jump the metro. Many of us maybe have done at least once. And this is one challenge, that they're not having the facility to the metro card or the resources to pay the MTA. But the other is that in some of the cases, they have to navigate the city for 1 or 2 hours to get to the school. This is sometimes within the shelters, or when they move out of the shelter, they're relocated. So they have to relocate the kids too. And this process is also re-victimizing the family. So they keep the children in the schools, but they have to transit for 1 or 2 hours. And this also makes them harder to be able to work. One of the moms that I interviewed, she said, I'm working here. She was working in a salon, in her salon, and us gave her the documents so the family could register the son in the bureau where the hair salon was, and not in the place that they were staying, because it was better for her to pick the kid up from work, and would not be able for her to do that if the kid was registered in the school where they were staying. Also related to the enrollment, this relocation has and continue to affect how children continue their education, as some of them, because of the relocation of the shelter, they have been transferred to another school, or they have just exit the school system, and or they stay in the same shelter than in the same school, or maybe in the same school but in different shelter. That's the example that I gave before. And the other percentage we don't know. Again, this is a qualitative research, but what is the scary part about doing statistics is, even though we have this 3% here, the fact that we don't have the information of what happened to this family is a reflect of the uncertainty of these times and the needs of instruction. I want to highlight the important role of IMSS schools and the parents to put a lot of effort in the enrollment, because navigating not only the city is hard, but also the enrollment process. In one of the interviews with IMSS schools, they mentioned the aspect of the technology. Sometimes even the families, they would give the passwords and their phones or the tablets to the team of IMSS school for them to help them navigate. This is the trust that they have to service that they're giving. And the other thing would be one. I want to highlight the networks around the families. One mom told me, sometimes I go to the parks and I talk to the other parents and I ask them how their kids are doing at school. And this is also because all of them, they share the ethnicity or maybe the country. They would say, I want to change my kid to this other school because this other family, this other friend that I know from shelter is doing good. There's a lot of challenges, and I try to put it like in a little in this small presentation. I don't know if I have a couple of minutes. Yes. The after school. Sometimes there are programs that are free, but it's very hard to register your kids in them. And this is so valuable for the moms that they have been able to enroll their kids in the after school because of the possibility to being able to work. And the other issues is the necessity to have legal assistance because they're not only facing for documents regarding their migration status, but also, at least in 3 cases, they have mentioned gender-based violence. And going to the lawyer, going to the hearings, and being in that bureaucracy and trying to get through the legal system, it also blocks the time that they would give to just taking their kids to school. I wanted to highlight in this slide, okay. Not only the services that are around the New York City, even though there are a lot of critics, there's also a lot of people that are thankful for them. In this research, I also knew about a lot of services that me as a student on an F1 visa as a migrant, of course, with a lot of privilege, I didn't know that I had. I'm awaiting my New York City card, for example. And also the organizations that are part from the community. I mentioned some of the organizations that were mentioned in the interviews that do this service, that provide these services. Sometimes either the public system do not have to offer, or they're collapse in the high number of cases that they manage. Like in the last point would be the mental health. I mentioned bullying, I mentioned gender-based violence. One of the mothers was facing separation, and she told me in the school they have this program, this banana split. So they talk with the children about the children whose parents are separated, about how to navigate the emotions and the difficulties facing, and they also would hold spaces for the parents to manage it the best way to navigate the separation, with thinking in the best interest of the child. This is an aspect that sometimes is overlooked when you're facing hunger, when you're facing housing, but it's as important as all of the other human rights services that everyone needs to be provided to survive. And this is about, like, we talk about problems which are resources. The school give us a space. So the school is a space that is transformative for the families, for the children, and therefore for the community. And how can we, in case, how can we support that this continues that? It's very challenging to think about conclusions and recommendations when we're thinking in entities or actors that maybe are not willing to be heard. And I think the challenge for the conclusions would be, and recommendations for them to be oriented to the community, to the universities, to grassroots centers that they are doing the work, but mostly also to enhance the resilience and the agency for the family, but mostly about the children, because even in all these cases, even if it's a gender-based violence in the journey, it is said, and I have heard this from lawyers too, children are indirect victims from these contexts, from these uncertainties. No, like, children are direct victims because they're facing them too. They are being exposed to this violence constantly. And we need to treat them like as that and provide them the services that they need in order for them to develop their autonomy in the best way. And goes without saying, like, not reducing the shelters, but improving them. And also the most coordination between all the systems, shelter, housing, and other providers. Food was one of the things that was repeated in all of the interviews. I don't want to repeat them because I think I've been saying these recommendations along the presentation. But I would mention this, like, sharing information about the services that are around the city, either public or from grassroots organizations, because a lot of the families, they face a lot of documentations, a lot of information, and sometimes what is needed is someone talk to them calmly and tell them, okay, what is the things that are you need? Are you need food? You need housing? You need to keep? Okay, let me help you navigate this information so you can provide this for yourself and your family. I know that I run a lot. We don't have a lot of time, and I'm sure, like, in the panel is going to be discussing more things. But thank you for your attention and also for the opportunity of being part of the research.
Good afternoon. My name is Natasha Quiroga. I am the Director of Education Policy and Inside Schools at the Center for New York City Affairs. We're thankful for this collaboration with Equity for Children, thanks to the support of the Zolberg Institute. As Kristen mentioned, Inside Schools has been around for quite some time, and we help families navigate the New York City public school system. They're very complicated and complex public school system, which makes it even more complicated for people who don't speak English, for people who are living in temporary housing as well. And so I joined Inside Schools just over 2 years ago. And really one of my major objectives and why I wanted to join Inside Schools was to come up with ways to expand Inside Schools offerings to support newly arrived migrant families who are living in shelters. And next slide. If you're not familiar with Inside Schools, what we're most known for is our website, which has profiles of all 1,800 public schools, really to help families figure out the high school application process. But has since expanded to help families with the application process for all of the grade levels, because in New York City, you have to apply for pretty much everything. So that makes it harder for people who maybe don't have the digital know-how to do so. And so since within just the past couple of years, we've also added some other resources to the website. We have a YouTube channel that has instructional videos offered in English and Spanish. We offer direct service to families who need some help with the application process. And really help families connect them to key educational resources, whether they need a special education lawyer, they have a bullying problem at their child's school. And, pretty much every year we get 1 million viewers of our website who come to our website to figure out and get the help that they need. Next slide. So what we've been doing for the past 2 years or so has been really impacted by who has been coming to New York City. So since the spring of 2022, New York City has seen over 230,000 migrants coming to New York City. Now, of those, about 60,000 have been bused from Texas, some from Arizona, but the busing has stopped pretty much since last year. And so a lot of people have made their way on their own, and many of these people aren't even living in the shelter system, but there's still a lot of people who were living in the shelter system. Those numbers have significantly declined, and it hasn't started just since the new administration. It's really started towards the end of last year. You can see the dips in the numbers as well. Part of that has to do with different federal immigration policies, but also has to do with the 60-day shelter limit, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So as of March 9th, so about a month ago, the numbers are 34,000 families with kids are living in the shelter system. And in the whole shelter system itself, it's just over 42,000 people in the shelter system. So 81% are families with children, and the rest are in single adult shelters. And the city has basically propped up over 200 shelters throughout this time period. It's hovering under 180 right now. The city is expected to close at least 50 more shelters by this June, including many of what's known as HERCs, the Humanitarian Emergency Respite Resource Centers. So those are the soft-sided facilities that were out at Randall's Island for the single adults, the one in Floyd Bennett Field for families, and then the big hotels. The Watson has shut down. The Roosevelt, which is the Welcome Center, is also shutting down. These large hotels in Manhattan are closing, which means that a lot of families are having to move out because they have no place to stay. Now, of these families, 48,000 students have enrolled in New York City public schools since July 2022. And this number really hasn't been updated, at least publicly announced what the numbers are for this current school year. So this is really up until maybe the very beginning of last school year. So we don't know where that's at. But again, those are kids who have gone through the shelter system and arrived. And Next slide, please. So one of the reasons why many of the families have left the shelter system and people have left the shelter system is because of the shelter limits that were imposed by the city. You know, many of you know New York City is a right to shelter city, but there were a lot as well, there's a lot of pushback by the mayor of whether that applies to migrant families. And it came down to basically for single adults, you only get single migrant adults, you only got 30 days, and then that was it. Unless you were an 18, 19, 20-year-old who was also enrolled in school or some sort of education program, you were allowed to remain in your shelter. And then for families with K-12 children or children under the age of 18, you were allowed to remain for 60 days. And if you could not find housing on your own, then you would be able to reapply for shelter. So in theory, these families were able to remain in the system for longer than those 60 days, but it still created a lot of instability and uncertainty amongst families. And the important thing to note is that the difference in the shelter, I'm not going to, we don't have time to go into the details of the different types of shelters, but the HERCs were run by New York City's health and hospital system. Those families were initially the first families to receive those 60-day notices. And then the city's Department of Homeless Services, or DHS, ran their own shelters system. And those families at first were not subject to the 60-day rule. They were added eventually last year, but no family as of yet, as it's been reported that they have received any 60-day notice. So it's just been the families in the HERCs. However, what we found when we were in a shelter, that many of the families in the DHS shelters received basically what we started calling a notice of a notice, saying, hey, you're going to get this 60-day notice at some point. So it's probably better if you look for housing now, the school's at the summer, before the school year starts. And so many families were freaked out because they thought they were losing their housing. It didn't explain, it was basically a paragraph. And so there was just more confusion. And initially, when the families in the HERCs did get their 60-day notice, they were placed in basically any shelter. If they reapplied, they were placed in a shelter that had space. And at that time, because once the notices started in January 2023, there were a lot of families coming. And so they were basically bounced to a shelter in a very far away borough, maybe in a different borough from where their child went to school. So what the outcome of these 60-day notices was pretty severe. You can see here how many families have received a 60-day notice. So 54,000 people have received a 60-day notice. That includes basically 14,000 families, which is 23,000 adults, about 23,000 kids. Now, of those that have actually expired, that's almost 24,000 adults with kids. And this is the pie chart showing where they've gone. And these percentages have changed dramatically since the first families who received the 60-day notice started in January 2023. So right now, 68%, at least as of early March, 68% of families have left the shelter system completely. The city does not track where they're going. So we don't know if they've left the shelter, just left the shelter system and they moved into an apartment, or if they left the New York City completely. We don't know where they've gone. When the city first started releasing this data, it was actually only at 35% had left the shelter system, but now it's almost double. And then 12% remained in their same shelter. And this is likely because of many of the exceptions. So there are some exceptions to the 60-day limit rule. Basically, if you are in your third trimester, until the baby turns 12 years old, you can remain in your same shelter. If the parent or a child has a disability or is too sick to move, you're able to remain in the shelter as well. And so 20% were transferred to another shelter. And again, those percentages have changed pretty dramatically since the city has started releasing that publicly available data. So go to the next slide. That's why we've seen just such a reduction in the population of families who are living in the shelter system. So like Stephanie mentioned, the vast majority of families who are going through the shelter system are coming from Latin American countries, with about 35% from Venezuela. And then the next largest group is from Ecuador, which is at 18%. And these percentages have actually changed since 2022. Ecuador used to be like 3 or 4, but since sort of the socioeconomic conditions have changed drastically in Ecuador, more people started coming. And then 9% of people are from Colombia, with the rest from Peru is like the sort of the next largest country. But we've met families from everywhere. Haiti, let's see where else. Colombia, Brazil, other countries. China, Russia,
India.
Ukraine. Not very many from India. No, but not a lot of families from India are in the shelters. Other like Latin American countries, the Caribbean.
English speaking Caribbean.
A few, okay. And then those are families. What's different is the population of these older newcomer youth or older unaccompanied youth, 18, 19, 20-year-olds come by themselves because they don't have a parent and they're on their own. They are living in the single adult shelters. They are typically coming from West African countries, so Mauritania, Senegal, Guinea, and they speak languages French, maybe, Pular, Wolof, Susu, or Arabic, and so present their own, also many other barriers that they are facing because they are own. Yet, if they have not completed high school in their home country, they still have the right to an education here, but it's been incredibly challenging. That's a topic for another research paper. Next slide. So in addition to everything that's been happening, inside schools, we've had to pivot just within the past couple of years, and especially with the results of the election, and then ever since Inauguration Day. So I'm just highlighting a few because there are so many, and the executive orders and federal actions that impact New York City immigrant families. The first one is just different attacks on status, and you may have read about some of these in the news, but just to review some of them. Okay. Many of the families that we meet have applied for asylum or in the works of working to apply for asylum, and some others have received status like temporary protected status, which allows them to remain in the U.S. for the amount of time that that country has the temporary protected status, and also to receive a work permit. But there have been so many executive orders and actions that have really increased immigration enforcement, and it's put them at risk. And so even though executive orders can't make new law or override federal laws or state or New York City laws, and many of these actions are legally questionable, most of them are currently being challenged. There's still a lot of fear and confusion amongst families, and there's still a lot of immigration enforcement. So for those who have temporary protected status, the current administration has terminated that status for Venezuela, and it was set to expire on April 7th or September 10th, depending upon if you're initial or not. However, that has been paused because of the lawsuit. So those Venezuelans whose TPS was set to expire on April 7th, for the time being, they're able to remain. For Haiti, it's set to expire on August 3rd. And then recently for Afghanistan and Cameroon, we're set to expire May 20th and June 7th. So all those dates are coming up, right? And so this is, again, making a lot of families very worried because many of them do have TPS. And another thing, once their status expires, it impacts their work permit and they can no longer have it. Another type of status that some families may have received is through the parole program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. This allowed many people to come in through a land port of entry, so being able to fly in from those particular countries if they had a sponsor and they were vetted. They also got a work permit. The new administration basically ended that program. It was set to expire April 24th. But just last Friday, thanks to a lawsuit, it's been paused. So at least for the time being, those people were able to maintain their status and their work permits. And there have been a number of executive orders and actions impacting and attacking funding. I think one most relevant to inside schools and our immigrant families is our cuts to U.S. Department of Education, their staff, and the proposal to eliminate the department completely. In terms of the staffing, about 50% of the entire Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, has been cut. And it's just some highlights. It's for our families that we're talking about is the Office of English Language Acquisition, which focuses on English language learners, which many of our migrant students are English language learners. They reduced the staff from OELA, the Office of English Language Acquisition, from 15 people to 1 person. And that 1 person has been reassigned and responsible for into sort of a different office. That's really huge. We're going to see the impacts of that. And then the Office for Civil Rights has basically been decimated. The staff size has been reduced by 40%, including the closing of the New York Regional Office for Civil Rights office. So a lot of impacts there. One additional one that, and then threatening federal funding for sanctuary jurisdictions. That has significant impact in New York, since New York City has different sanctuary jurisdiction policies, and then designating English as an official language, even though New York City provides and has certain local policies that require translation of city provided materials in the 9 languages. For DOE, it's 9 languages, and for New York City Public Schools, it's 9 languages. It's likely to impact federal documents, websites. For example, if you're applying for certain different status, applying for asylum, the information that is provided for you on the website, your ability to translate, it's likely going to be gone. When you go to immigration court, you can request an interpreter in your language. That is likely to be gone if English is designated as the official language. And then just the expanded enforcement has been really caused a lot of harm to our immigrant families, especially the rescission of the sensitive locations memo. This was a memo initially that would basically where immigration enforcement was not supposed to happen in places where children gathered, churches, playgrounds, hospitals, where we sort of wanted to encourage people to go. That memo was rescinded very quickly, and so schools was included in one of those locations. However, New York City Public Schools has some very strict policies in terms of how schools deal with non-local law enforcement coming to their campuses, and they have been very proactive in providing training to school staff and principals. But at the same time, it doesn't protect people who are going to school to drop off their children. And then there's just been increased immigration enforcement within the interior United States, as well as in New York City, and just more risk to people, whether they're undocumented or not, as we've seen people with green cards being picked up by ICE. And this additional criminalizing of immigrants, so this new registry requirement that requires undocumented immigrants or people who have had no interaction with immigration courts or the system to be required to register effective last week. And this has presented a challenge not just for our newly arrived migrant families, but also undocumented families in New York City who've been here maybe for decades. So sorry to be a downer. Next slide. So inside schools, we initially started out providing support to families to help enroll. And just a shout out to my colleagues here, Leidy and Dashel. Dashel, we were fortunate to hire last year. Last year. And he's been going into a lot of the shelters and helping families. He also manages our WhatsApp helpline for families, and Leidy has provided assistance with her knowledge of the public school system. But there's been a lot of challenges. And so initially we started helping families with enrollment, especially when there was a large influx in the summer of 2023. Inside Schools was in the shelters, helping families enroll in school that summer, because while the DOE provided 100 coordinators in the shelters to help families, at the time, there were like 65,000 families and kids in the shelter system. And those coordinators were not allowed to work the 2 weeks before school started, based according to their contract. So there were a lot of families who were living in shelters who, for weeks to months, who were not enrolled in school. And we often met families, and we still meet families who are like, no, we haven't enrolled my child in school because we just don't know how to do it. Or we got a placement, but it's too far from my shelter, and they don't know who to ask. And I think that's been a really big challenge, as well as language and technology barriers, because to apply for many of the different like high school, middle school, 3K, pre-K, kindergarten, summer rising, it's all done online on the My Schools platform. And while the My Schools platform is translated into 9 different languages, not everything is. There are errors in the code. So very important words like accept, decline for different waitlist offers, it's not translated. Things this is basic of create new password, it's not translated. And so we've been alerting DOE whenever we come across it and saying, asking them to please translate it. But even if it was translated, it's confusing to create an account. Some families don't remember if they created an account. Some families don't even use email. And so we've had to help families create email addresses as well. And then the housing instability has really impacted families in terms of the school that they're attending. You know, Stephanie showed that graph of the families who moved. That has not been updated since, I think it was the March 2024, summer 2024. So we really don't know what the impact is. But anecdotally, we know that teachers are reporting that kids are no longer in their classrooms. They don't know where they've gone. And even though the city implemented a new rule where if you received one 60-day notice and your child is in K through 6th grade, you're not going to receive another 60-day notice. And initially, if you did get a 60-day notice, you were supposed to be, you're supposed to be placed in a shelter in the same borough as the child's youngest school. Wait, no, the youngest child's school. That's right. Yeah. There are other kids, right? And so, and a lot of the families did not realize that they also had the option of maybe finding schools nearby, so they didn't have to go and do these 2-hour commutes. One family that we worked with, he had there was a 1st grader and a 7th grader, and didn't realize that there was such a thing as a K through 8th grade school. And when he found out, he was like, that's amazing, I want one of those. And when he pushed back at the Family Welcome Center, the staff member there told him, well, you have to accept these 2 separate schools, otherwise we're going to deport you. So there's a lot of challenges beyond that, and really shows the need for advocates and organizations like Inside Schools to support families. We accompany families to Family Welcome Centers, and we basically step in where the New York City Public Schools can't, because there's so many families who just are falling through the cracks. And despite, you know, a lot of this information being shared within the shelters at the HERCs, initially at the DHS shelters, because there were so many new shelters sort of popping up, there was not a service provider in many of these shelters. And so because the length of time it took to sign the contracts, those shelters were run by National Guard members and temporary DHS staff. And their primary objectives were safety, security, and food, or safety, shelter, and food. So there was no service provider. DOE was sending their shelter-based coordinators into those facilities, but there wasn't really a schedule, and was sometimes at the request of the shelter staff if a new family enrolled, but families weren't told the schedule. Sometimes the coordinators didn't speak their language. They had nobody to ask. And so that's why we would we had a partnership with DHS to go to those shelters where there was no shelter provider. And we're often asked these other non-education questions because these families had nobody to ask. Sometimes the staff at the shelter didn't speak Spanish as well. So we get questions about, I need an immigration lawyer, or where do I get health insurance? We need some clothes. Where do we go for these things? And so that's sort of where we were stepping up to provide support. National became an expert in finding adult ESL classes. We learned a lot about childcare. So we added figuring out how to connect families to childcare and applying to childcare, which is even harder than applying to high school, especially for families who are not eligible for certain childcare vouchers. And the challenge also continues because families who were not able to find placements near their jobs, like one of the moms that Stephanie met with, or the shelters, finding after school care or childcare, they lost jobs. They lost job offers because of that, unfortunately. And so inside schools, we have a page of free programs. It's a database. You can search by borough and by type and location. And we're using our own tools to help families find those processes. And families, many of the families would be eligible for what's known as a Promise NYC voucher, which is childcare voucher for undocumented families. But it's very limited and the wait list is really, really long. And the funding ends in June. So it's been really hard to find any sort of childcare where many of the families are eligible. And then what we've seen, especially since the new administration, since Inauguration Day, is increased cases of bullying, especially bullying of non-citizen students by citizen students. And this would be across all grade levels, from elementary school all the way up to high school. So next slide, please. So what we've been doing a lot, we talked about the enrollment. Another big challenge that Stephanie mentioned is school transportation, because while students who live in temporary housing have the right to school transportation, many of them were not getting it. So there's sort of a breakdown on who has the right to busing. Many of these kids had the right to a school bus, but at the time in 2023, that summer, there was the threat of a school bus strike. So there weren't enough bus drivers. And so there was a long wait list. And so the result was that these kids were supposed to get a Metro card. And so while the kid might get a Metro card, the parent who has to escort the child to school, there was a right for the parent to also get a Metro card, especially for the K through eighth graders. They weren't getting those cards. And there was this huge circle that would happen where the shelter would tell the parent, you have to get the Metro card from the school. The school would say, you have to ask your shelter. And so they didn't know where to go. Sometimes the school would say, oh, we don't have any more. They would just run out, and it would take a long time for them to get any new ones, where you had families who had to pay out of pocket. One of the dads we spoke with, they resorted to selling water bottles on the street just to pay for their Metro cards to take their kids to and from school, even though they have the legal rights, according to the Kenny-Bento Homeless Assistance Act, to a Metro card to escort their children to and from school. And then New York City public schools is very different from school in Latin America. Many families have just even the simple question, like, what is middle school? Right? And the expectations were different. Trying to understand that if you're tardy a certain number of times, that could lead to an unexcused absence. And these are the consequences of too many unexcused absences. So helping families to understand that system, referring them to childcare for if children had a special need or a disability, making sure that they were able to access those services, and after school programs, adult ESL, and we had to pivot basically with the results of the election of adding Know Your Rights sessions and emergency planning sessions to our programming. And we found this was a way to increase attendance at some of our events because so many families had questions about these things, but also they were worried. They were so concerned about what was going to happen that it was hard to focus on their kids' education. So for the first time ever, we encountered families who did not want to apply for pre-K or pre-K because they didn't know where they were going to be in the fall. know if they're gonna be in a different shelter or even deported. So they just didn't see the point, right? So we added these Know Your Rights sessions to our trainings to really try and provide that knowledge for families to feel a little bit more comfortable. But again, it's right with all of everything that's happening, it's still challenging. The next slide. 2 more minutes. Okay, so this is what we've been doing. The numbers are probably not updated because we haven't had a chance to update the numbers, but we serve at least 1,300 families. I think we're probably 1,600 now. It's been a lot for the past 2 years. We've been in 16 shelters throughout the city. We do a lot of one-on-ones. This is Dashiell's bread and butter, where he talks to families one-on-one, helping them apply as well, and creating those instructional videos. This is Gigi, who is also a part of our team. We do videos in English and Spanish because we can't be in every single shelter. Our team is very small. And so sharing these videos with families has been helpful as well. And we can't do this alone. We partner a lot with other community-based organizations across the city, and we're part of different coalitions to do this work too. And here's a map of, if you can go to the next slide, of where we've been. It's basically all over the city. Some of these shelters are huge, like Archer Pride is really, really big. They had 700 families. And then you can see the concentration in Midtown, and that's primarily because those are where the majority of the perks were and a lot of the shelters too. So how much time? 1 minute?
Yeah.
So I know that was a ton of information, but you know, we're very proud of our work. It's been a lot of pivoting in the moment because there is a constantly changing dynamic, not just with the new policies that keep coming through and the new executive orders, but also with the city, because the city has been, while they have certain services available, there's been a constant change in the city's policies, whether it's a 60-day shelter rule, and even within New York City public schools. And so we have to be nimble enough to be able to create new content on the fly, to be able to meet the needs of families. And the important thing is to meet families where they are, whether that's in shelters, at resource fairs held throughout the city as well. And just a note of the events that where Stephanie was able to meet families, those were held over January. And what we saw is post inauguration day, a sharp decline of participation in in-person events. So we actually held a Know Your Rights and emergency planning session virtually, January, like right before the inauguration day. It was supposed to be in person, but it was slated to snow, and many of our families coming from Latin America do not do well in the cold. So we shifted it to virtual. We had a pretty decent turnout, and we decided to host an in-person clinic the following, I think, two Saturdays from them, because to do the emergency plan, you really need to meet in person. There's a lot of documents. And so that's where Stephanie met with a lot of families. But that was the second week after the inauguration, and families were scared and they were concerned. And so we saw a decline. We actually had only 50% people who confirmed multiple times with Dashiell show up. It was also cold that day. And some families said, this is our move date from our shelter, so we can't come. And then the event we held at the Historical Society, a very similar thing, you know, families are, it's a new site, but also they're worried. We've seen now it's sort of shifted. We've seen more increase in person attendance. We hosted an event here at the New School. We had 100 parents and kids, a Know Your Rights session. We did one at Fordham. We had over 150 families attend. So whether or not people feel more comfortable going to events or they need the information so that they're going to be there, we're not really clear on that, but that does impact, you know, the amount of families who participate in this survey just because of the timing of the event. So,
Thank you.
okay.
Next, I would like to introduce Professor Columba González Duarte. She's anthropology professor here at the New School for Social Research, a doctor in sociocultural anthropology from the University of Toronto. And in her work, she connects the different territories, Mexico, Canada, and now New York City, the US as her new place, home and work. And because of your background work with the monarch butterfly, and I'm happy that you're joining us in this panel. I had her classes of migration and ethics of care, and also another class of feminine ecologies in Latin America. And I think this would only, like, your comment would only enhance the research that we are doing, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
No, it's okay, it's okay.
Very funny. Thank you so much. I'll try to keep it short because I really would like to hear more of your answers. It is hard to comment on something like this because it feels very hopeless what we're seeing, and it's the consistency of the information is not giving us a lot of room to imagine otherwise. So probably that's where I would like to go. And I am going to start with the monarch butterfly because I think with this butterfly that migrates, and I'm going to make a connection with what I think could be interesting slide of thinking or exploring to see how we create another or a real sanctuary city. So I was thinking in the word sanctuary, which means something that is sacred or a sacred place that is safe. And there's all this history of making sanctuary cities, first in Berkeley for those who descend, and now New York City. And we know they have been under attack for different reasons, making it very hard to be a real sanctuary. It's interesting that the monarch butterfly migrates from Canada, United States, and Mexico, arrives to Mexico, hibernates, and these sites in which they hibernate are called sanctuaries. And I was thinking, what is the connection? And this has come to my mind before, but really, when I was preparing for this, I wanted to think what it means to create shelter that is safe, and not necessarily this type of shelter that it is. We need them, but they're not safe, and they're not a sanctuary. So the butterfly arrives to Mexico. I don't know, you have seen these butterflies, and you say that you work in conservation. It's a protected butterfly with a lot of difficulties in terms of how sometimes protecting this insect also displaces humans from their own forest and their own home. Arrives to this forest in Mexico, they hang from the trees all together, and they go dormant. So all the insects from Canada, United States, so what we call today Canada, United States, arrive to this place, they stay dormant, wing to wing. And it's exactly the wing to wing what provides them shelter. And they create a sanctuary themselves by being together. Because when they are together, they keep humidity, the temperature, like they sort of create a different organism in the forest by just that behavior of collectively spending the winter. And that for sure to me is what makes a place sacred and safe, is that behavior of being together. At the same time, that forest is also sacred for the communities. They see the forest as a sacred place. So when we talk about sanctuary in this butterfly, the idea of the butterflies as a sanctuary, it is completely right. They are safe, although they are going through so many things, like it's very hard for them to migrate, just human migrant. And they are safe in the sense that people see this forest as a sacred place. And what will it mean to really bring the essence of being together and keeping a place safe in the case of the city? How difficult it is, because what Stephanie has presented and Natalia has presented, Natasha, sorry, has presented is consistently that it is completely difficult to do this, and it's becoming even harder. So part of my question was, because of what I get from what you're telling us, Natasha, is that the state, who has been not precisely doing his job in the best way, is going to get slimmer, right? Because it's going to get less resources, it's going to get more cuts, it's going to be harder. What is the role that we have as people living in this city to really make it a sanctuary city and safe with these challenges? Is it we're going to have to give more volunteer work? Is it getting more money from private organizations because the state is not going to provide them any longer? So I would like to hear from you, Natasha. Where do you see the possibilities of really building sanctuary Is it gonna come from the private sector? Is it gonna come from the citizens who we're gonna be, I'm not a citizen here, but residents who are a bit with more privilege to really step up and do the work that the state is no longer gonna do it? Because I cannot imagine this topic future in which like we don't know where they go. Like, and I can imagine for sure from my work with migrant workers in Canada. And a little bit here, many years ago, I worked at the border, the Texas border with migrant workers as well. They don't want to return. Like the place is not safe at all. They do not have sanctuaries back home. Like the reason they did it is because clearly this was the option to keep their families alive. Right? So when you say, well, you don't know where they're going, it's clearly they're not going to be self-deporting, but they're going to try really hard not to get there until the point in which it's very unsafe to do it, right? Like it's becoming so hard to say here that probably they will try. But I'm just wondering that we can no longer ignore what is going to happen if these type of policies keep increasing in that way. So if it's going to get harder, what's our role as society to step in and to create sanctuary and to create other type of cities? And for Stephanie, the question that I have, and probably to you, Natasha, as well, is that you're both here presenting in this very clear way how difficult it is. And I can also imagine how difficult it was for you to listen to these stories, how difficult it is for you to be present there, just recognizing and listening the many, many violences that these people have been through. And it is clear there is trauma, and it is clear that we're not, as researchers, always prepared to face that. So I was wondering if you can also give us more information on how do you experiencing as researchers, but also as human beings, that part of listening to these stories, and what is that telling us about the type of research that we need to do? Do we need to do more interdisciplinary research? Do we do to care for each other more as researchers as well? Because when we have these type of settings, it is very easy to just at some point absorb and not being able to propose a different thing because it is overwhelming. So what do we do with the overwhelming data at a personal level and to keep this research going? Because we do not want to shut down the research or stop listening. We do want to keep listening in these ethical, important ways. And finally, a note that I have, I mean, this is probably a little bit abstract, but this is what there is all of what you have been presenting, either from doing that qualitative research or the types of very concrete actions that you take through your organization. It is a form of care. It is a form of providing very specific care to those who are being pushed away in these difficult ways. And this makes me think if this is the way in which we build better societies, through that specific way of providing care, because the state is not doing it. The state is not going to care. The school system, although it's trying, is very hard for them to create as well for the children. So it seems that it is really that face-to-face of that's coming from another space, which is not fully an institutional space, the one that provides care. And how do you think that or feel about providing such care and that care being a way in which we can build sanctuary? Those are the ideas that I have. Comments on that.
You wanna- or-
Let's start with the question, if not, we'll lose the.
Okay, yeah, I'll answer the first question you had about, to the camera. What's our role to provide sanctuary? And like whose job is it? I think that we're not gonna see the state step in. I think private funders, when I first started this role, I thought it's so easy to get private funders to give us grants to do this work. It was hard. It's still hard. I was really surprised at that. A part of it is because private funders said, no, this isn't our role, this is the city's role. And that was really disappointing to hear. And then with the, since the election, some funders are worried, they're scared. They don't want to be targeted. And so we're seeing that, right? Now, some funders have stepped up. They recognize the need, especially the immediate need. But for the most part, I think we are taking care of us, right? It's the community. It's all these grassroots organizations that are providing support. A lot of our partners are volunteer-based. For good or bad, right? Like they should be funded. Many of these people should be paid. I think one of the efforts that we've tried to do is also to have volunteers who come from the impacted communities who can provide support because they've gone through these experiences. We've seen a lot of New York City residents, New Yorkers through and through, who have stepped up. They have sponsored families. They escort families to their ICE appointments. They are learning the ways to help families fill out asylum applications. They've come to us to provide support to help families apply for high school. And that's really, unfortunately, like we're depending upon the people. It's not coming from the state, it's not coming from the private sector. And like in terms of how does that make you feel? Right? Like we are the ones that have to provide parents. It's really frustrating. It shouldn't have to be this way. We should be working hand in hand with the state, with the private sector to be able to provide these services. There are enough resources to go around, but it's not that way. And it limits our ability to do our work. We've only been in 16 shelters. There are 160 shelters for families that have been in New York City since 2022. We can't be in every single one. Our team is basically, we're now down to 3. It used to be 4, and pulling in like lighting. We've served over like 1,500 families just amongst us. Like, can you imagine how many more families we've served? And there are so many more families who need support, right? The New York City Public Schools has made efforts, but many of these families have experienced so much trauma. They're very vulnerable and they need that one-on-one assistance. They need somebody to listen to them and to show them step by step to do things or to do it for them until they're able and capable to do so because they're so preoccupied with everything that they're missing.
One of the things that I was thinking with your question was that when I was back in Peru, I was in a privileged position because I work for the government. So I actually did a migrant research about Venezuelan children in migration in Peru. But I was privileged enough that I had like people, policymakers in front of me that were willing to hear what we were saying. The institution. I think one of the things that has worries us as researching is that who is going to listen what we have to say or we have to recommend. I think that's one of the things that we're trying to think through in doing the recommendations, like push our brains to write things that can be useful because we can do a lot of research, we can do a lot of interdisciplinary research, yes, we should. But what would be the outcome? Not another paper, not another printout. How can we do something that would actually be useful for the migrants? And it touched me personally because I'm also a migrant. Of course, I have a lot of privilege, but I cannot I can mirror a lot of challenges and difficulties of people that I interviewed had. And I value a lot that I had first psychology first aid training before. And I think it was challenging, but hearing a lot of very hard stories, as I'm sure Dashiell and Natasha have heard. What I'm thinking also from as a lawyer point is what kind of resources can I give back to the person that are participant of this research? And what I found out is that not only because of the Inside Schools, I'm talking to Gabriel, talking to Dash, talking to Natasha, and also Gigi and Maricruz from Inside School. I have information that I can give them back with when I have seen the loops in the thing, I don't know how to do that. Then after the interview, you said that, let me share you this information, maybe it's useful. And in the same way, they have shared a lot of information with me. And I appreciate that because even though I was in the privileged position, it was also cared for. And I deeply appreciate a lot of the things that I've been told, things to do, recommendations, to see. And just the question would be how to do with the data and how to, as a researchers, have the eye enough to identify these problems. When we think about bullying, for example, like you mentioned that too, Natasha, I remember one case. Mom said that her kid was being like hurt in the bus by an Italian girl. And it was very like it was very sensitive. And the first reaction is, of course, in the conversation, like, why would they do that? Like, what happened to the girl? But to think that the kid that is bullying is also victim of another type of violence in another circle, and they're reproducing this violence in bullying. When you were mentioning the monarchs, I was thinking, of course, like people that are involved in the services providing, they're trying to do it in the human work, this kind to provide this service as sacred. And I think people prefer in-person contact rather than the technology in most of cases, not only because of the distance that we find technology, but to understand better. And I say that also because here in the new school, a lot of students have been like bombing with like us with information about like what you should do with your business, like resources, know your rights, and it's a lot of information to handle. And I cannot imagine how a person that is like a mother that have 2-3 children that doesn't know the language would feel with all these not only pamphlets but the links and like sometimes in the shelters they're like the walls are like full of papers with information. It's like how can we navigate this like bombing of words that probably we don't understand? So having the opportunity to sit down with someone that would like help us navigate is not only responding, like giving, fulfilling people's rights, but also giving care and psychological care that maybe it's not worded like that. But I have seen some of you doing that in the workshop, and like even in the way that you hear the active listening, because this is also happened with lawyers, like client comes and tell you this problem that they have, family matters, they talk for 30 minutes and you don't interrupt them, but you have, while you listen, you identify the problems that they have like in the legal dynamics. So this is also important with providing services like hearing, giving like active listening, and after they told their story, they told the journey, you like also identify where do they need help. And yes, like how can this is also part of the research, how can we maybe involve more people from the community, from the new school in the program of inside schools? Like, it is possible to call for more volunteers, and how can we reshape narratives so people are not scared to be involved in research that involve migrants? And I think we have been thinking a lot about making everything anonymous, not recording, taking notes, because of course there's also said by in the White House, they said like, and everyone doing work with migrants are also like criminals too. So it puts us in a very vulnerable position. And how can we continue doing this work, but also feeling like the people that are providing the services that are doing research, because it's not only us, there are a lot of other students in the Solver Institute that are doing research and work with other migrant communities. It's like, how can we keep ourselves safe? And I think this space, this conversation is useful to think it through. And the last note I would appreciate is of course your question, but to keep in mind that this mental health access is crucial. And of course, we are not going to get psychologists for everyone. It's not available in our countries, and it's not available in the city. But what if we have like this first aid training, so we can respond like with a patch in this case? This is one of the multiple challenges of this, and is to keep in mind that we are not heroes. We're not going to solve all the problems that we're talking about. I think it's great that we are able to identify these gaps around the circuit, and just trying to keep it one step at a time. Like you said, first we were doing this enrollment support, And then we identified other points. How can we add those steps in the support? Yes, I don't know how to. It's a very hard question. But I think that the invitation is it's provoking to push a little bit more on how not only we're going to continue this research because there's another round of interview, but also to put down the recommendations or the things to do, the conclusions in a way that is not only doable, but also being very strategic in the way that we write and we talk, so that other people could hear what we have to say. And this is like being like legally strategic in you're doing a lawsuit, but I think you mentioned a lot of lawsuits that have stopped different physicians with this administration, and I think let's keep pushing it that way. We don't have law school in the new school. I think we have a lot of people that do advocacy, and I think we can hold the space to do that. Fabio, I think we can do that.
I just want to introduce myself. My name is Charles Bradley. I'm a postdoc with the Zolberg Institute, and I have my PhD in education, and I do research on refugee education. And so this is a very near and dear topic to my interest. So I just want to introduce myself because I'd like to continue this conversation. I unfortunately have a meeting in 2 minutes that I have to get to, but I want to throw some questions out, and maybe Gabriel can share the recording with me later and I can see your responses. So one thing is like, I think that kind of talked about is like, what role can Zolberg and other researchers who are interested in these topics play? But there's kind of like some things that are coming to my mind is like mapping kind of the longitudinal trajectories of these students and trying to focus on pinch points or leverage points where we can support them where they're facing bottlenecks in their advancement. So like, we don't want to buy into the idea that if they miss out a year of school, they're behind and they're never going to catch up, right? That's clearly a false narrative. So it's not great, obviously, but it's something that we can catch up on. There's accelerated learning programs that are out there that have been proven to work for lots of students from migrant and refugee backgrounds. So thinking about where these catch-up places can be and what kind of research can help us understand and identify those things and mobilize resources to help us do that. And I'd love to hear, Natasha, from you also kind of like in the past or in current era, like what level of intervention seems to be the most effective? I hear what you're saying about the bureaucratic enmeshment that we face in New York City at the and maybe at the district level or at the city level, but have there been school level interventions or community level interventions that you've seen that have worked that we can reproduce in different ways and in different communities, and how can we kind of facilitate that? Another thing I was wondering about was copying other kinds of interventions that we've seen in law, for example. I know you're a law degree. Both of you. Okay, cool. So, you know, like my wife's a lawyer as well, and she does these kind of community support programs for helping people get through bureaucratic processes. So I got my master's degree at Teachers College, for example. I know there's probably a huge cohort of master's students who, if you guys wanted to start some sort of like, you know, mobile bureaucratic paper filling thing, they would love to help out with that. So this, I'm just kind of like throwing ideas out there and see what sticks and see if there's anything that I can support you with, or that Zolberg can support you with, or that we all can. Teachers College can support you with. So like, yeah, literally just getting master's students into a room and having them help fill out paperwork, I think is a totally doable intervention. And yeah, going back to those kind of leverage points, like community college, like a lot of research and education shows that education is primarily a credentialing process. So like, how do we think about where these ties are for credentialing, like getting through middle school or getting through into community colleges? What role can community colleges play? I know this is big thinking and you guys have been on the ground and you're like, nope, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. We've tried that. We've tried that. Nope. But I'm just trying to think of things that maybe we can help you support, you know, whether it's money or anything like that. And what are some other things that I was thinking about? Yeah, I guess I can stop there. But oh yeah, then the last thing is like whether you think it might be possible to leverage this moment of nationalization, of Trump closing doors and cutting funding, to now search for resources from international organizations that historically have kind of kept their fingers out of the United States. So places like, I used to work for UNICEF, places like UNICEF or other kind of larger UN agencies, or international groups like BRAC or Oxfam, etc., who historically are like, no, the United States is fine, they're doing well, you know, and now they're like, oh, well, actually, we could actually support those types of things. And whether that's something you guys are interested in pursuing, and I can, maybe make some connections, or we can start talking and get the ball rolling with people who are in the education sector, those international organizations, to see if we can get funds together for something like that. I think, piloting something in New York City makes a lot of sense, and maybe they'd be willing to do that in combination with Solberg, in combination with your guys' organizations. So anyway, lots of ideas, lots of me talking. I unfortunately have to step away, but I will be watching the recording carefully. And I really appreciate you guys bringing this up and talking about it. And just to say, I hope we can connect again, kind of talk about these ideas. I'm here for at least another year, so I'm happy to talk through these things. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
And then someone else. Go ahead, yes.
I have a little question. I think it was Stephanie who said something about the threat of sexual violence in the shelters for the migrant children. And what I was wondering was, I think I've heard that in ordinary homeless shelters for, let's say, citizen type people, that the women and children are kept separate from men. There's, I think it was mentioned that there are shelters just for single men or men who are here on their own. But I was wondering if what's being implied about this threat of sexual violence is that maybe there are families, or so I don't know how that works, but I think I've heard that in the ordinary shelters, women and children are together with each other but separate from men. I like to hope that would reduce such threats, and I wondered if you knew anything about it. Also, I would just like to remark something that I'm sure every one of us here knows. According to Mayor Adams, he spent millions and millions, I don't know if it was 200 million or how much, over the past 3 years with all the new migrants, and that even in the Biden administration, when he asked for money, they only gave, I don't know, a few million, which we now know the current administration doesn't even want us to have that, but it was like a pittance. And Biden was supposedly sympathetic, supposedly, but I don't know, maybe he wasn't in charge of releasing that money. Maybe it had to go to Congress. It was Republican Congress. Maybe that was part of the problem. I don't know, but so this business of running out of money in the city in June or whatever it is, unfortunately, I think we probably all know it has something to do with that situation somehow. I'm glad to hear that some people are getting jobs and learning to navigate the system with the help of your great groups. But, we do know that it's very troubling, the current environment. Do you want to respond?
The
And you wanna
shelters.
Also talk about mental health, just because it's been such a theme.
Yes, so shelters, we have 3 systems actually in the city at this point, because you have the immigrant shelters that are hotels actually, and that have all these set up where people maybe, I'm introduce myself. I worked at very friends with Equity for Children since the beginning. I'm a mental health worker. I work for victim services. And because I speak a few languages, I end up getting clients from all over America, Africa, Europe, and so it's kind of from everywhere a little bit. Because I speak Spanish, French, and Portuguese, so that's kind of cover Africa besides America. So, so most of my clients, they come to me through referrals because they have been victims of violence, and the violence have happened in their countries of origin, or here, or in the process of getting to the US. So we don't distinguish, just like victims are victims no matter where. So what's happening with is like there are 3 systems in the city. One is the hotels that are shelters. Then you have the homeless system where you have also separation. You have the like the single woman is one piece, single man is in another place, and the family shelters for homeless. And then you have the third system, which is the domestic violence shelter system, that mostly are, for the most part, women with their kids,
sometimes the victim is a male, not a woman, so there is a whole work about having males also family, like, but the head is a male, not, you know. So those are the three systems. They are separated. What I hear about violence in the shelters now in the immigrant shelters is more about domestic violence and sexual violence. Yeah, so what I hear also is all the stories about that is so common with our population, the populations we serve, is that the the amount of people to come to us and discuss just childhood sexual violence experiences is so high. In, you know, like in all kind of countries and also from the US too. But the other thing is, because I'm talking to clients daily and other clients, and we have like a whole clinical body where everybody is very nervous about what's happening. But we also have to remember this is not the first time that we are having this pressure about immigration. Hopefully, this is going to change. We don't have immigration law for 30 years. There has been no change in immigration law. I think under Obama, we had the highest number of deportations in the US since we can remember. I don't know how this is going to play out in the future, but this is not new for this population. The population is new to this experience because we are talking about all this influx of new immigrants that happened in the last years. And so if you talk with someone that has been here longer, they are afraid, but they are looking to the repetition of the story of the stress over the immigrant about their status. And so we all hope that this is going to change. I don't know if it's going to last or we don't know which way it's going to go. But one of the things that I hear you talking, I'm like, yes, we all come from, not we all, some of us here come from, Latin American countries where we have had the experience of doing more with less. And I think that this is what we need to start doing. Start looking to programs and see how we can change our programs in order to expand services to absorb this population. So very recently, I was having an issue also with numbers because we couldn't absorb new cases that we work with. It's an alternative to incarceration that is happening in Queens because of the prostituted women on Rosette Avenue, and we didn't have the ability to absorb all of them. We just are starting a new program, very new, that had to be approved by so many different people, where instead of doing the individual sessions that we're doing for years, because this resolves their legal piece, right? So they clean the legal piece. Now we are going to do group workshops for this population, and the legal system agree to allow this as compliance with court. So there are solutions, and it's about thinking how we can do this. I think that I'm really like, we are all in shock. We are all traumatized. At this point, we are not responding because we are just paralyzed with the thing. And I really hope that we're going to have some time to start processing what is going on so we can find this path. I think the legal system is starting to do this when they are starting these processes. And I hope this is something that can happen more. It can continue, but I think at this point, it's like, when you talk about trauma, one of the first responses is being paralyzed. And that's what's happening now. So let's give a little bit of time to start those processes of constructing new programs and responding to those needs. Because people heal, people move on. So that's what we need as a society to do this point.
Thank you. I could not answer that as better as you did, but just to add, like, yes, I was meaning domestic violence because I have like the legal structure from South America. When I think of gender-based violence, but also threats of like family members of people around that know some of the people in the shelter do not have their document yet. It's like, I'm going to call eyes on you. So I don't know, that's not domestic violence or like gender-based violence, but there's this other threat among, so that doesn't, that's a practice that is to induce more terror, but I totally agree with.
Absolutely, and I
100%.
think that this is part of what, trickling down, and we see this whole thing about, there's about dividing and putting people against each other. Because what I see also is older immigrants that have been in the US before this group that is coming saying, why are they getting all this when I came in, I didn't get any
Yes.
help,
Yes.
right? So it's like, what?
Yes.
Why they can get a work authorization, they are applying for asylum, and some people, so many people that have been here for so many years don't have any kind of status. So I think that's the danger, is about kind of when you start bringing down, it's about throwing groups against groups, like the internal fight about it. And that's, I think, is the issue that we are really working on. That is to unify these groups and say, that's not different. And also, the other thing is thinking about your city and the money that went into the hotels. I think the fight shouldn't be for more shelter, should be for affordable housing for everybody in your city. Every immigrant or not.
Yes.
Can I say one thing to that? I know somebody from the senior center who's an older man who's homeless now. And he went to a shelter, I guess a shelter just for men. And he left and he preferred to live, I don't know, in a park, or I don't know where he's living. Because he said, don't tell anybody. Okay, I'm telling you, but I'm not telling you who he is. He said, don't tell anybody, but he's sure there's drug dealing going on in this all men's homeless shelter, wherever it is, and that he feels endangered. He feels threatened, actively or just peripherally or something.
No.
And so it's a very sad situation. And like you say, all these people deserve some kind of sort of permanent housing. Now, I just want to mention, maybe you've all heard of some story of a year ago about some guy in the Bronx who was renting, got an apartment. He was sympathetic to the single male migrants who were being forced out after a month and all that. And he was maybe renting out, like maybe they have like 3-4 beds in a room, and they pay $100 a month or $200 a month, something per. And at least it's something, and supposedly a sympathetic landlord type person. I don't really know, but supposedly they can afford it. They have some sort of jobs. That's just one little example. I don't know. You probably don't know these kind of things, these kind of stories. I just want to mention.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you everyone for being here and hearing us out and like adding up to the discussion. And this was also a space that we were looking for this ongoing research that we're doing. And I think that the things that you have added to the conversation, the questions that you have given us, it's invaluable to the thing that we're doing right now, and looking forward to do more things, and maybe in which ways we can support the services inside schools. I don't know if there are some questions from
Questions from the online, but
we wanted to appreciate all of the people online too for being here. Probably we're going to continue the conversation here, and we're going to share we can share the slides, and we have printed out some of the reports, the preliminary results of the reports. And when it's done in May, we're going to forward, and we can look forward to continue this conversation. At least in my case, I just signed up the PhD program here at Anthropology, so I have more years for here, and to continue accompanying the work that you're doing. And again, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you also for
thank you
hosting
everyone for
the
your time.
hybrid space.